The unlikely encounter. It was early on a crisp spring morning when Marcus, a garbage collector, found himself in an unfamiliar part of town. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of the affluent neighborhood. The houses here were grand, their white columns gleaming against the backdrop of blooming cherry trees and ivy-clad stone walls. Marcus had been working the city's sanitation routes for over a decade, and yet, despite the familiarity of his job, today felt different. The truck he drove was large and rumbling, a deep, industrial green, with the logo of the city's waste collection service painted on the side. It was a job like any other, and Marcus had long ago come to terms with the unspoken hierarchy of the city. His uniform, a plain, faded blue with a name tag that simply read Marcus, was one of the many invisible markers of his position in the social structure. People rarely acknowledged him as he worked, and when they did, it was often with a mix of indifference or disdain. The neighborhood he was servicing this morning was no exception. As he moved to empty a series of trash bins placed neatly at the end of each driveway, Marcus could feel the weight of the gazes that followed him. It wasn't overt. No one came right out and said it, but the air was thick with judgment. These homes, with their freshly waxed cars parked in circular driveways, their perfectly trimmed hedges and pristine lawns, were not meant for someone like him. The truth was, he was the only black man working in the area, and his presence always seemed to draw the unwanted attention of those who looked upon him as an outsider. The whispers of the residents, though subtle, were enough to make Marcus uncomfortable. What's he doing here? This neighborhood's for people like us, not for them, one resident murmured from behind her floral curtains. Another, a man in a crisp suit and tie, cast a glance at Marcus as he walked past. Shouldn't they have their own part of town to work, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. It was a reminder of how many in this wealthy enclave viewed people like Marcus as invisible workers meant to be seen only in the context of their service, and nothing more. Yet Marcus had learned to shut out the voices, to focus only on the task at hand. It wasn't easy, but over the years, it had become second nature. He understood that his job was one that didn't demand attention or accolades. He was a worker, an anonymous cog in the machine of the city's daily functions. He didn't expect people to see him, and he didn't want them to. But today, things would be different. As Marcus moved the trash cans one by one, a movement caught his eye. From the corner of his vision, he saw a small figure standing at the edge of the driveway of one of the grand homes. It was a little girl, no more than 10 years old. She had golden curls that seemed to catch the light, and she wore a simple white dress that fluttered in the wind. At first, Marcus thought she was just another curious child who found amusement in watching the garbage truck, but as she stepped closer, he noticed something strange about her. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed directly on him. There was no fear or hesitation in her gaze, no wariness of the man in the uniform. She studied him intently, her head tilted slightly, as if trying to figure him out. There was something about her that felt different from the other children who occasionally waved or asked about the truck. She wasn't just observing him with childish wonder, she was watching him, understanding him in a way that made Marcus feel uneasy. The girl took a few cautious steps forward, her bare feet brushing against the cool, dew-covered grass. She reached the end of the driveway, and without any further hesitation, she walked directly toward him. Her small, delicate hand reached out to him. "I know who you are," she said, her voice soft but firm, almost as though she had known him for much longer than the few moments they had shared. "You're here to help. I can show you where you need to go." Marcus blinked, unsure how to respond. She was a child, just a child, and yet her words carried weight, as if she were speaking from a place of knowledge he couldn't quite grasp. "I'm sorry, what?" Marcus asked, his confusion clear. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He had been working in the neighborhood for a while, but he had never spoken to any of the residents, especially not a young girl like this one. "I know what you're looking for," she repeated, her voice not demanding, but insistent. "You don't have to hide. I'm not scared of you." Marcus took a cautious step back, not out of fear but out of confusion. He had no idea what she meant. What was he supposed to be hiding from? Who was she talking about? Before he could ask another question, she continued, her tone softening as though she was speaking to a friend, not an outsider. "Follow me. I'll show you the way." Marcus felt a sense of uncertainty bubble up inside him. Why would this little girl, this stranger, want him to follow her? It was a strange request, one that he couldn't ignore. But there was something in her eyes that made him pause. It wasn't fear, it was something more. Trust, perhaps. Or perhaps a simple curiosity, a child's natural inclination to explore the world around her without prejudice or bias. Still unsure of what to do, Marcus found himself nodding slowly. He didn't know why, but he found himself following her. She led him past one pristine home after another, her little feet skipping ahead with an ease that made it seem like she knew exactly where she was going. Her golden curls bounced with each step, and her voice, though soft, was filled with an unmistakable determination. "My name is Lily," she said as they walked. "And this is my neighborhood. I live here with my father, but sometimes he's too busy to notice me." Her voice was tinged with a sadness that Marcus couldn't place, but he didn't ask. He didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable. They arrived at a small, ivy-covered garden at the back of one of the houses. The fence was high, and the air smelled of freshly bloomed flowers. The space was isolated, far from the eyes of the other residents, and there was a small hut at the center of the garden, camouflaged by vines and trees. Lily gestured toward the structure with a smile. "This is my secret place," she said, her voice full of pride. "I made it all by myself. It's where I go when I need to escape. You can come here whenever you want, if you need to." Just as Marcus was about to respond, he heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the house. A tall man, broad-shouldered and sharply dressed in an expensive suit, emerged from the front door. His face was already contorted in anger, his hands clenched at his sides as he stormed toward them. "Lily," he shouted, his voice harsh. "What are you doing with this man? Get away from him." The moment the man spoke, a surge of panic rushed through Marcus. He had no idea who this man was, but the way he was being addressed, the anger, the hostility, made it clear that this was a confrontation he had not anticipated. Lily's expression shifted from innocence to determination. "Dad, please. He's not a bad man. He didn't do anything wrong." But the man wasn't listening. His eyes locked onto Marcus, and he took a step toward him. "I said, get away from my daughter," he bellowed, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. Without thinking, Marcus took a step back, raising his hands defensively. "I'm not," he began, but before he could finish, the man's voice drowned him out. "Call the cops," the man yelled, turning on his heel and marching back toward the house. "Now." Marcus froze. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks, the situation had already spiraled beyond his control. The rising tension. As the father stormed back toward the house, Lily's small form remained rooted to the spot, her defiance palpable in the way she stood her ground. Marcus, still processing the rapid turn of events, felt his heartbeat quicken. The moment the man shouted for the police, Marcus knew he was no longer just a garbage collector doing his job, he was now part of a situation that had spun far beyond his comprehension. The quiet suburban street, so serene just moments ago, now hummed with tension. Marcus couldn't help but notice the change in the atmosphere. The usual white fences, the neatly trimmed hedges, the luxury cars parked outside those perfectly manicured lawns, all of them now felt like the walls of a fortress, trapping him in a place where he didn't belong. Lily's father had already disappeared into the house, his angry footsteps echoing against the stone driveway. From where Marcus stood, he could just make out the shadow of the man moving behind the curtains in the front window. Lily, however, had not moved. She stood as though nothing had changed, as if she were still holding on to the belief that Marcus was not the threat everyone seemed to think he was. "You don't have to call the police," Lily said softly, though her voice was filled with determination. "I promise, he's just trying to do his job. He's a good person." Her words were meant to reassure, but Marcus could feel the weight of her father's decision pressing down on him. He wasn't sure whether it was the innocence in her voice or the silent plea behind her eyes, but in that moment, he felt an overwhelming desire to protect her, to make sure she didn't get hurt, even if it meant taking on the brunt of the fallout. Lily's eyes locked onto his with a fierce intensity. She looked up at him as if she were reading his thoughts. "Don't worry. They won't be able to take you away. You didn't do anything wrong." Marcus's heart tightened. Her faith in him was both humbling and heartbreaking. She didn't yet understand the reality of the world she lived in, but Marcus did. He had spent years navigating the subtle and not-so-subtle prejudices that governed how people viewed him, his race, and his role in the world. Being black in this neighborhood meant he would always be seen as an outsider, no matter how long he had been serving the streets. This child, for all her wisdom, was still innocent enough to believe that the world could be different, that people could be trusted, that misunderstandings could be corrected by simple words. But that wasn't how things worked in the world Marcus knew. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens reached his ears. They were coming. The police, just as the father had ordered. Marcus could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins now. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding anymore. This was something bigger, something he had no control over. Lily, sensing the shift in the air, turned to face the street, her expression unreadable. She looked back at Marcus one last time. "Please don't be scared," she whispered. "I'll make them understand." Before Marcus could respond, 2 police cars appeared around the corner, their sirens flashing, the sound growing louder with each passing second. They pulled up to the curb, and 2 officers stepped out, their heavy boots echoing against the pavement. One was a tall man with short-cropped hair and a stern expression, while the other, a woman, had a more approachable demeanor, though her eyes still held the professional wariness that Marcus knew all too well. "Sir," the male officer called out, his tone clipped but polite, "we received a call regarding a potential issue here." "What's going on?" Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mind raced, searching for the right words. He hadn't done anything wrong, but how could he explain that to 2 strangers who were already looking at him with suspicion? He glanced over at Lily, who had remained quiet, standing by the edge of the garden, her small hands folded in front of her like a child trying to make sense of the adult world. "I'm just doing my job," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady. "I'm the garbage collector. I was just speaking with the little girl, Lily, right here." Her father got upset, and now, he stopped himself, unsure whether to continue or simply wait for the officers to speak. The female officer raised an eyebrow, her gaze shifting between Marcus and Lily. "You're the garbage collector?" she asked, as if trying to confirm what she had just heard. Marcus nodded, trying to make himself sound as calm as possible. "Yes, ma'am. I'm just here to do my job. I wasn't doing anything wrong." The male officer took a few steps forward, his posture stiff and formal. He didn't seem convinced. "You understand why this situation is concerning, right? A man in your position approaching a child like that, especially in a neighborhood like this, it's not exactly something that doesn't raise some eyebrows." Marcus's chest tightened. He could feel the implications of the officer's words. The way the officer said, "your position," felt like an accusation, as if Marcus's job and his skin color had already made him guilty of something he hadn't done. "I'm just doing my job, sir," Marcus repeated, his voice low but firm. "I wasn't trying to cause any trouble. The girl came to me, not the other way around." The woman officer turned her attention to Lily, her gaze softening. "Lily, what happened here? Did this man do something to you?" Lily hesitated, her small lips pressed into a tight line as if she were deciding whether to speak. Finally, she stepped forward, her feet padding softly against the grass. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for such a small child. "He was just talking to me. I wanted to show him the hut I built in the garden." The officers exchanged a glance, their faces unreadable. The male officer crossed his arms. "Lily, sweetie, are you sure?" Lily didn't hesitate. She nodded, her blue eyes never leaving Marcus. "Yes, I'm sure. He didn't hurt me. He's a good person. You don't have to be afraid of him." The woman officer knelt down to Lily's level, her expression softening even further. "Okay, Lily. We just have to check things out, okay? We'll make sure everything's all right." Lily nodded in understanding but still didn't let go of Marcus's presence. She looked at him, the sadness from earlier creeping into her eyes. "Don't leave," she whispered, almost pleading. "Please don't let them take you away." Marcus felt his throat tighten. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything would be fine, but deep down, he knew the situation was out of his control. He was in a place where his presence alone seemed to stir up fear. No matter how kind his intentions, no matter how many innocent conversations he had, it seemed that someone like him could never truly be accepted in a place like this. The officers stood in silence for a moment, as if weighing the situation, their eyes flickering back and forth between Marcus and Lily. The street was quiet now, save for the distant hum of the traffic on the main road. It felt as though time had slowed down, the world holding its breath, waiting for the next step to unfold. But just as Marcus prepared for the worst, the front door of the mansion opened again. This time, it wasn't the father. It was a woman, tall, with a stern, composed face. She had the unmistakable air of authority, someone used to managing difficult situations. She stepped onto the porch, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. "I'm sorry, officers," the woman said, her voice cool but controlled. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'll handle this." Marcus felt a pang of relief. Whoever this woman was, she was the first person in this neighborhood to speak to him like he was a human being. A shifting tide. The woman who stepped out onto the porch was a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the air. Her sharp posture and calm demeanor projected an aura of authority, as though she were accustomed to managing situations just like this, complex, delicate, and fraught with unseen layers. She wore a tailored, dark blue jacket and high heels, her perfectly groomed hair a contrast to the more disheveled appearance of Marcus and Lily, standing in the garden like two people caught in a storm. The officers, who had been on edge, seemed to relax at her arrival. The male officer, who had been the most vocal in his suspicion, turned toward her with a slight nod, as though recognizing her immediately. He stepped back, allowing her space to address the situation, while the female officer remained silent, studying the scene. "I'm sorry for the interruption," the woman said, her voice smooth and controlled. "I'm Evelyn Thatcher, Lily's mother. I believe there's been a misunderstanding here." The officers stood still for a moment, assessing her. Evelyn's presence immediately commanded respect, her calmness standing in stark contrast to the tense energy that had been building. Lily, who had been holding her breath, seemed to relax at the sight of her mother. Her posture softened, and a small, relieved smile tugged at her lips. The male officer gave Evelyn a skeptical look but nodded. "Ma'am, we've received a report about a man interacting with your daughter in a manner that some found concerning. We need to ensure that everything is all right." Evelyn didn't flinch at the officer's words. She wasn't one to be rattled easily. Her gaze swept over the scene, taking in Marcus, the police, and Lily standing by his side with unwavering trust. She turned her eyes back to the officers, her gaze firm but not unkind. "I understand, officer," she said, her voice never wavering. "But I can assure you, my daughter has not been harmed. She's simply been speaking with Mr. Thompson here." Marcus felt his heart race at the mention of his name. He hadn't expected her to defend him, especially not in front of the police, whose judgment he could feel still lingering in the air. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat, unsure of how to respond. Lily stepped closer to her mother, her small hand tugging at Evelyn's sleeve. "Mom, I told them. He didn't do anything wrong. He's a good man. We were just talking about the little hut I made." Evelyn gave her daughter a gentle smile, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, sweetie. I'm sure everything is fine now." The female officer, who had been quiet up until this point, spoke up. "So, you're saying this man is a friend of the family?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Not exactly, but Mr. Thompson has been working in this neighborhood for a long time. I've seen him around. He's just doing his job." The male officer raised an eyebrow, his skepticism not yet gone. "But, ma'am, what was your daughter doing with him? It's not exactly normal for a child to be so familiar with a stranger, especially one in his line of work." Evelyn's gaze softened, but there was no mistaking the firmness in her tone. "My daughter is a curious child. She tends to talk to everyone. But that doesn't mean she's in danger. I'm sure you're familiar with how children can be, innocent, trusting. But that doesn't mean they're naive." She paused, her eyes lingering on the officer. "And it certainly doesn't mean they deserve to be treated with suspicion just because of who they're speaking to." The words landed heavy in the air, a subtle challenge to the assumptions the officers might have been carrying with them. Marcus watched, surprised and somewhat moved by Evelyn's calm, direct way of handling the situation. She wasn't just protecting her daughter, she was quietly dismantling the assumptions and biases that had been built around him, that had been hovering over his every move since he'd arrived. Evelyn continued, her gaze now fixed firmly on the male officer. "My daughter's safety is my priority. If you think there's been any wrongdoing, I'm happy to cooperate fully. But if you're here simply because a black man was speaking to a little white girl in a rich neighborhood, then I believe you're wasting everyone's time." There was a long silence as Evelyn's words hung in the air, challenging the officers in a way that made it clear she wasn't about to back down. The tension that had gripped Marcus's chest slowly began to ease. He couldn't help but admire the way she spoke so candidly, so unapologetically. There was power in her voice, a quiet strength that made the situation feel less like an accusation and more like an opportunity for understanding. Finally, the male officer sighed, a small concession of defeat. He glanced at his partner, who seemed to be deep in thought. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice softer, though still carrying an edge of professionalism. "Well, if that's the case, ma'am," he said, "we'll need to wrap up here. We just wanted to make sure everything was okay." Evelyn gave a slight nod, as if to acknowledge the officer's attempt at professionalism, though her gaze remained unyielding. "Of course. But please, in the future, don't make assumptions based on appearances. Not everyone who works in this neighborhood is a criminal just because they don't live here. Mr. Thompson is doing his job just like anyone else." The female officer, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, finally spoke up, her tone more conciliatory. "We understand, ma'am. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. We'll be on our way now." The officers exchanged a few more words, before the male officer gave one last look at Marcus, his expression unreadable. With a nod, they turned and made their way back to their cars. The sirens faded as they pulled away, leaving behind a silence that felt both oppressive and strangely freeing. As the police vehicles disappeared around the corner, Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Lily, who was still standing by her mother's side, watching him with an intensity that made him feel both small and seen all at once. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes softening. "Thank you for your patience," she said, her tone unexpectedly kind. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. It's ridiculous that you were even put in that position." Marcus gave a small, uncertain nod. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he said, his voice low, his gaze briefly meeting Lily's. Evelyn's eyes softened even further. "I know. It's just, sometimes people react to things they don't understand. You're doing your job, and that's all that matters." There was a quiet understanding between them, a recognition that, though the situation had been resolved, there was more beneath the surface, an unspoken acknowledgement of the world's biases, of how easily assumptions could be made. Lily, sensing the shift in the air, took a small step forward, her hands clasped in front of her like a little soldier. "Can I show you the hut now? It's really cool," she said with the same earnestness that had brought her to speak up earlier. "You can even see the whole neighborhood from there." Marcus chuckled, the first real laugh he'd had since the whole ordeal had started. The tension in his shoulders slowly melted away, and for a moment, he allowed himself to forget about the weight of the world pressing down on him. "I'd like that," he said, his voice lighter now. "Show me your hut, Lily." And as they walked toward the small, ivy-covered garden, the last remnants of the morning's chaos seemed to fade into the background. There, in that quiet corner of the world, a strange peace settled over the three of them, Lily, her mother, and Marcus, each of them trying to make sense of a world that seemed too complicated for simple answers. But perhaps, in moments like this, it was the small, simple things, the hut, the trust, the fleeting moments of understanding, that could offer a glimpse of hope. A lesson in silence. The small garden behind the mansion, though meticulously cared for, felt more like a refuge than a showpiece of wealth. The vines that climbed the trellis had a natural, untamed quality to them, their green leaves spilling over like they had been left to grow without the confines of a strict gardener's hand. The rustling of the leaves in the light breeze seemed to carry with it a sense of quiet sanctuary, as if the garden itself was trying to preserve the peace that had almost been broken moments before. Lily led the way, her small feet padding across the soft grass with a confidence that suggested she had walked this path 1,000 times before. Evelyn, ever the composed figure, followed closely behind, her gaze shifting between Marcus and Lily, as if ensuring that the awkward tension that had filled the air earlier wouldn't creep back in. Marcus, still feeling the weight of the police encounter, found himself grateful for the quiet. The adrenaline that had been pumping through his veins began to ebb away, and he realized just how much he had been holding back, how many years of experiences he had tucked away in the corners of his mind, memories of moments when he had been made to feel small, less than human, simply because of the color of his skin. He'd grown used to it, that quiet discrimination that seemed to follow him everywhere, even in a place that should have been a sanctuary. But Lily's presence was a balm, her innocence a reminder that not everything in the world was painted in shades of suspicion and fear. Her trust in him was like a light in the fog, a quiet affirmation that there were still spaces where things could be different. It was rare for him to encounter such purity of belief in another person, especially in a world that seemed so determined to divide them. Her faith was unshaken, even after the confrontation with her father and the arrival of the police. As they reached the far end of the garden, Lily stopped in front of a small wooden structure that seemed almost hidden, camouflaged by the thick ivy that wrapped itself around the walls. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, a tiny, secret haven tucked away from the world. The hut was modest, simple, and yet there was a sense of pride in the way Lily had built it, as though every nail and board had been placed with care. Marcus glanced at Evelyn, who stood a few steps back, her arms crossed as if waiting for him to take in the scene. There was a softness to her now, a warmth that had not been present when she first arrived at the scene. Her composure had not wavered, but there was something new in the way she observed Marcus, as if she were seeing him for the first time without the filters of fear or suspicion clouding her judgment. "Here it is," Lily said, turning to face Marcus with a smile that was as bright as the sun overhead. "This is my little hideout. I built it all by myself." Marcus couldn't help but smile back at her. There was something endearing about her confidence, the way she spoke of the hut with such pride. It was as though this small, unassuming structure held the key to a world of possibilities for her, a world where imagination could roam free without the limitations of reality pressing in. "It's beautiful," Marcus said, kneeling down to her level as he examined the wooden door, the intricate carvings that adorned the edges, and the small windows that let in just enough light to make the inside feel alive with potential. "You did all this on your own?" Lily nodded, her face glowing with pride. "Yeah. Well, I had some help with the roof from Dad, but mostly it was me. I wanted it to be special." Evelyn, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "Lily has a very active imagination. She's always building something or coming up with new ideas. It's her way of dealing with the world around her, I think. She likes to make things her own." Marcus looked up at Evelyn, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. For a moment, he could see her as more than just the composed mother who had stood up for him earlier. There was a depth to her that he hadn't noticed before, a woman who, like him, had learned to navigate the complexities of the world and had found ways to protect the ones she loved. "I think she's got a good thing going here," Marcus said, turning back to the hut. "She's got the right idea. Sometimes, the best way to deal with things is to create your own space. A place where the world can't touch you." Lily's eyes lit up at his words, and she jumped up to tug at his arm. "Exactly. That's why I built it. So when things get too crazy, I can just come here and think. Nobody can bother me here." Marcus chuckled softly, feeling a warmth spread through him. For all the complexities of the world outside, there was something profoundly simple about Lily's outlook, a child's perspective that hadn't yet been tainted by the harsh realities of prejudice, fear, or judgment. She had created a space of peace, where only imagination and wonder could thrive. Evelyn, noticing the moment of connection between them, took a step closer, her gaze softening. "You're right," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Lily's always had a way of finding calm in chaos. It's something I admire about her." There was a long pause, and for a moment, the three of them stood in silence, taking in the peaceful atmosphere of the garden. The tension that had been so thick earlier was slowly beginning to lift, replaced by something quieter, something more meaningful. They weren't just two strangers and a child anymore, they were, in this small, shared space, beginning to understand each other in ways they hadn't expected. After a while, Lily grabbed Marcus's hand and pulled him inside the hut. "Come on, I want to show you the inside. It's my secret room." Marcus followed, bending low to fit through the small doorway. The interior was just as charming as the exterior, wooden beams lined the walls, and there were makeshift cushions scattered around the floor. On one side, a small table was covered with papers, drawings, and books, an organized chaos that spoke of creativity and a mind that refused to be constrained by the rules of the world. Lily gestured to the table. "These are all my plans for new stuff I want to build. Like a treehouse, and a swing, and maybe even a bigger hut." Marcus looked at the drawings, smiling at the enthusiasm that spilled from every line and shape. "You've got some big dreams, huh?" Lily grinned widely, her golden curls bouncing. "Yeah. And I'm going to make them all come true, one day." Evelyn, standing just outside the hut, watched the exchange with a mixture of pride and concern. She had been watching Marcus carefully, as though measuring him, trying to determine what kind of person he really was. The way he interacted with Lily, the way he respected her space, her dreams, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She had feared that the police encounter might have revealed something darker in him, but now, seeing him in this quiet moment with her daughter, she realized how wrong she had been. Lily's laughter echoed through the small hut as Marcus picked up a few of her drawings and began pretending to be a great architect, making plans for an even grander fort. It was a game, a simple moment, and yet it carried more meaning than anyone might have expected. There, in that tiny corner of the world, it felt like they had found a moment of peace, where no one was judged, where nothing was assumed, and where dreams could be as big as a child's imagination. The world outside, with its judgments and divisions, could wait. Here, in the hush of the garden, it was just them, Lily, Evelyn, and Marcus, sharing a quiet moment of connection. And for a fleeting second, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different after all. Cracks in the surface. The days that followed the tense encounter with the police seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. Marcus found himself back to his regular routine, collecting trash, making his rounds through the affluent neighborhood, but the lingering effects of that morning still simmered beneath the surface. The encounter had been a jarring reminder of the world he navigated every day, a world where assumptions were often made before facts had a chance to be heard. It was a world where a simple mistake could cost you everything. Yet, there was something different about this neighborhood, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. There was a layer of complexity in the way the residents interacted, an underlying tension that clung to the manicured lawns and pristine streets. It wasn't overt, but Marcus could sense it, like a current running through the air. It made him uneasy, made him wonder if this place, despite its outward appearance of wealth and civility, had as many cracks in its foundation as any other. That evening, as he finished his last stop, he noticed Evelyn standing by the fence at the edge of the garden, looking out into the distance. Her posture was straight, as always, but there was something about the way she held herself that spoke of quiet frustration. It wasn't like the confident, composed woman he had met earlier. This was a different side of her, one that seemed less certain, more vulnerable. Lily was nowhere to be seen, and Marcus wondered for a moment if she was inside, busy with her drawings or playing in the hut. He thought about walking past, respecting her space, but something about her expression tugged at him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt drawn to her, as though there were a conversation yet to be had, something unspoken that needed to be shared. "Evelyn," Marcus called softly, his voice carrying through the garden as he approached. She turned, her gaze meeting his. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a flash of something he couldn't quite place. She hadn't expected him, not at this hour. The stillness between them stretched for a moment, filled with the weight of the unspoken history that they both carried. "I wasn't expecting you," she said, her voice quiet, but not unfriendly. "Everything okay?" Marcus hesitated, feeling the familiar weight of words he didn't always know how to say. He wasn't sure what had brought him here, what had prompted him to approach her this evening. But there was something in the air, a shift he couldn't ignore. "I wanted to check on you," he said finally, his tone more uncertain than he had intended. "I saw you standing out here alone. Thought you might want to talk." Evelyn blinked, a flash of something passing through her eyes. She turned her attention back to the horizon for a moment, as though weighing whether or not to let him in. The evening sun cast long shadows over the garden, its light soft but fading, just as the day itself seemed to be winding down. "I appreciate that," she said after a moment, her voice softer now. "But I don't know if I'm the best company right now." Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "Is everything okay? You seemed off this morning." "It's been a lot, I know." Evelyn sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly as if the weight of the world had suddenly settled onto them. "It's not just this morning," she said, her voice low and distant. "It's everything. This place, this life. It's starting to feel like I'm just holding it all together, but it's barely holding it all. The truth is, I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that everything is perfect when it's not." Marcus stood in silence, his gaze softening as he listened to her words. It was clear now that the cracks he had sensed were not only in the neighborhood but in the person standing before him. Evelyn Thatcher, who had once seemed so strong, so composed, was unraveling before him, in the quietest of ways. "You don't have to pretend," Marcus said, his voice steady, though a pang of sympathy tugged at his chest. "Not to me, anyway." Evelyn's gaze flickered toward him, her lips pressed tightly together. There was something fragile about her in that moment, a side of her that she had kept hidden, even from herself. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of her jacket sleeve, as if trying to find the right words, the right way to admit what she had been holding inside. "I didn't want to be like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to become this person. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I got so caught up in keeping up appearances, in making sure that everything looked perfect on the outside, that I forgot who I really was. And now, I'm just tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of this life. Tired of the constant pressure." Marcus stood there, his heart heavy with the weight of her confession. He had known that there was more to Evelyn than met the eye, but hearing her speak so openly about her struggles made him feel a strange connection to her, one that transcended the usual barriers between them. In a way, they were both fighting the same fight, though they had been born into different worlds. She, with her wealth and status, and him, with his unremarkable job and everyday struggle to survive. But both of them, in their own ways, had been trapped by the expectations placed on them, expectations that had nothing to do with who they truly were. "I know it's hard," Marcus said softly, his voice filled with understanding. "Life's not always what we think it's going to be. We all get lost sometimes." Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She blinked quickly, trying to regain her composure, but there was a vulnerability in her gaze now that hadn't been there before. "I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I knew how to be happy. But I don't. And I don't know if I ever did." There was a long pause as the two of them stood there in the growing darkness, the garden around them quiet and still. Marcus felt an urge to reach out, to comfort her, but he held back, unsure of what would be appropriate. Instead, he simply remained by her side, offering a silent presence that, in some strange way, seemed to be enough. After a long while, Evelyn spoke again, her voice steadying as she wiped away the tears that had begun to slip down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said, looking at him as if apologizing for letting her guard down. "I didn't mean to unload all of this on you. You probably don't want to hear it." Marcus shook his head. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm glad you're sharing it with me." Evelyn offered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Marcus. It means more than you know." For a moment, they stood together in the silence, the weight of their words settling between them like a quiet understanding. The tension that had initially existed between them, between two people from different worlds, with different lives and histories, seemed to dissipate, replaced by a shared sense of vulnerability. They were no longer strangers, bound by assumptions and misunderstandings. They were simply two people, carrying their own burdens, their own dreams, their own wounds. The sun had set now, and the cool evening air settled over the garden like a blanket. In the distance, Marcus could see the soft glow of the streetlights coming to life, casting long shadows across the yard. He knew it was time for him to leave, but he didn't want to. Not yet. There was something about this moment, about this connection, that felt like it was the beginning of something new, something that neither of them had expected. "I should probably get going," Marcus said, his voice softer now. "I've got to finish my rounds." Evelyn nodded, her smile small but sincere. "Of course. Thank you for stopping by. And for listening." Marcus gave a small nod before turning toward the gate. As he walked away, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the conversation lingering in the air, the unspoken understanding that had passed between them. The world outside, with its divisions and its judgments, hadn't disappeared. But in that moment, it felt like the world had become just a little bit smaller. And perhaps, just for a while, that was enough. Breaking boundaries. As Marcus made his way out of the garden and back onto the paved streets of the neighborhood, the quiet night stretched before him. The cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of calm that was in stark contrast to the events of the day. He walked slowly, his thoughts tangled, replaying the conversation with Evelyn in his mind. He couldn't help but think how much had shifted in just a few short hours. The tension that had existed between them had dissolved in the quiet moment they shared, and something new had emerged, a connection built not on their differences, but on shared vulnerabilities and human understanding. It was a rare thing for Marcus. In a world that so often demanded that people hide their true selves, he had found an unexpected honesty in Evelyn. But as he walked, his thoughts returned to Lily, the small girl who had, without even realizing it, played a pivotal role in this shift. Lily, with her fearless belief in the goodness of others, had made a place for herself in his heart. Her spirit, untainted by the world's prejudices and assumptions, had shown him what it meant to look beyond appearances and see people for who they truly were. And yet, Marcus couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that lingered, like a cloud hanging over his thoughts. The situation was far from over. There were still unspoken words, unresolved questions, and the looming threat of more challenges ahead. The town he had come to know, for all its beauty and wealth, had a darkness that was rooted in centuries of division and inequality. The morning's incident with the police had been a stark reminder of that reality. Marcus paused at the corner of the street, his gaze lifting to the mansion in the distance. The tall structure loomed like a monument to privilege, casting a shadow over the rest of the neighborhood. He couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could he, how much longer could anyone, pretend that this place was any different from the rest of the world? He had seen the way the residents whispered about him, the way they looked at him when they thought he wasn't paying attention. They hadn't welcomed him here, they had tolerated him. The question of whether that could ever change hung in the air, as heavy and elusive as the fog rolling in from the bay. Still, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something had shifted. That quiet moment with Evelyn had stirred something in him, a sense of possibility. Maybe there was a way to bridge the gap between worlds. Maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. With a deep breath, he began walking again, this time heading toward the part of the neighborhood where his own humble home lay. The streets here were different, quieter, more worn. The houses, though modest, held a quiet dignity. They were lived in, their faded paint and overgrown lawns telling stories of families who had built their lives with care and love. The contrast between the two parts of the neighborhood couldn't have been more striking. The wealth on one side, the working class on the other, a stark divide that seemed to define the world around him. As he approached his own house, a familiar figure stood on the porch, silhouetted against the dim porch light. It was his older brother, Derek, leaning against the railing, his arms crossed in that familiar posture of contemplation. "Long night?" Derek asked as Marcus climbed the stairs, his voice filled with the quiet humor that always seemed to ease the tension in Marcus's chest. "Something like that," Marcus replied, glancing over at his brother. Derek was a constant in his life, a steady presence who had always been there, even when Marcus felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. He wasn't much for words, but there was a wisdom in Derek's silence, a quiet strength that Marcus admired. "You look like you're thinking about something big," Derek said, pushing himself off the railing and walking toward Marcus. "Got that look in your eyes? You know, the one where you're trying to figure out what comes next." Marcus chuckled softly, the sound of it feeling foreign after the weight of the day. "Yeah, I guess I do. A lot's been going on lately, man. I don't even know where to start." Derek raised an eyebrow, his expression half amused, half curious. "Why start at all? You've been doing just fine without worrying about it." Marcus looked at him, his mind still reeling from the conversations he had had that evening, the quiet moment with Evelyn, the way the weight of her words had settled into his chest, the realization that the world wasn't as simple as he had once thought. "I don't know. I guess I'm just tired of playing it safe, tired of letting things stay the same." Derek considered his words for a long moment before responding. "Safe's a luxury, Marcus. It's nice, sure. But if you don't take risks, you never get anywhere. You can't change things by sitting back and waiting. You want to make a difference? You've got to take the first step. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of his brother's words sink in. Derek had always been the one to push him when he needed it, to make him see that life wasn't just about surviving, it was about living with purpose, about fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. I think I'm starting to figure that out, Marcus said quietly. The two brothers stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the neighborhood night filling the air, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves in the trees. It was a moment of peace, but it was also a moment of realization. Marcus knew that the path he was on was not going to be easy. It would require more than just a willingness to speak out or stand up, it would require the courage to confront the things that had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface. The world wasn't going to change overnight. But maybe, just maybe, Marcus could be a part of that change. Maybe he could be the one to take the first step. You sure about that? Derek asked, breaking the silence, his voice almost playful. Marcus grinned, feeling a spark of determination rise within him. Yeah. I think so. And as the evening wore on and the last of the daylight faded into night, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was on the horizon. A shift, a moment, a chance to make a real impact. He didn't know exactly what it would look like, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face whatever came next.